It is a humbling honor to have the chance to respond to Mr. Gnagner's presentation this morning. But not only a humbling honor, as well a pleasure. As a peace and development worker in Colombia, our country has much to thank the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the gratitude is also at a personal level for in the communities I've had the chance to work with. I can see what the effects of this dual approach are on the ground. Let me begin by also giving some personal observations which respond to or complement those given by Dr. Gnagner. He says, for a quarter of a century, there was never a day without fighting going on somewhere in the world. For the 15 years I have been involved in peace work, there have never been a day without people working for peace anywhere in the world. At this day and age, there are more organizations and more professionals worldwide working to end conflict and to transform them and prevent violence than ever in the history. The Peace Nobel Prize, awarded a few weeks ago, had the largest number of nominees than ever a Peace Nobel Prize has had. A second response, when Dr. Gnagner says, wars are there to last, I must say, so is peace. We have seen the very immediate example of Europe. Germany, France, Switzerland, half a century ago, and the situation today. But if we were to go back to the regions we're discussing, such as Colombia, I've also seen lots of failures in ceasefire attempts. In fact, 5 ceasefire attempts in Colombia have failed throughout history, a large one during my lifetime. But also 5 successful ceasefire attempts have come to make it to the books, although they are not so popular. I remember the time where M19, one of the largest guerrilla and most sanguinary groups, was to be feared in the rural areas of Colombia. Today they are a political group, and their leader is the governor of one of the departments of Colombia. And that's there to last as well. A third observation, political will can make the difference, says Dr. Gnagner. I second this, and I would add to that peace work has changed from the 60s when peace workers were saying wars are too serious to be left to military. Then they started engaging the political leaders in discussing matters of diplomacy. And a second generation of peace workers said wars are too serious to be left to military leaders. To political leaders. And so today, what we're trying to get across is the fact that wars and peace are two serious matters to be dealt single-handedly by any group. So although political will can have a definitely high standard, and it can have a very large impact in addressing violence, it is the time for us to realize that it in itself will not be sustainable. Such was the case of the 2004 ceasefire attempt that took place in Colombia, where Pastrana and the leaders of the FARC guerrilla demonstrated to the country that they were willing to sit down and talk, but the communities were not involved. It's the case of today's process with the paramilitaries in Colombia, where the leaders have proclaimed demilitarization, dismobilization, but many of the soldiers or fighters and other scales have not been involved in the process, and therefore they rearm and form new groups. Another observation at the personal level, wars are among people rather than so-called conventional between structured armed forces or sovereign states, as it was said by Dr. Gnagner. He refers to the collective memories. Many generations down the line, those who were exposed to abuse or to extreme violence will remember their ancestors and the things that happened to them, and it remains in the collective memory, in the sentiments. One of the things that we discussed yesterday is that conflict is a complex phenomenon, and one of the key aspects of it is how people are feeling. Transforming conflict is much more than ending the violence, however difficult that task is, as it has been presented. These attitudes need to be healed as well. And I cannot think of a single good example to bring up to this conference where an international organization, where a community has dealt with that in a systematic manner. And therefore, if we only stop the fighting, if we only end the shooting, but do not address the root causes of why there was a conflict in the first place, naturally, conflicts of armed nature will come back. Another observation, much skepticism can come for peace workers when all of a sudden, after years or months of intense work, seemed blurred by a single act of violence, a single killing, a single act of brutality. However, more than ever in history, there are directories and full libraries of actions that have sustained. However, on the other hand, they're not so spectacular to show. And we're still learning the history at our schools of the wars of humanity, the history of those who fight, and we're still, in our days, glorifying violence through movies, through our symbols in the streets of our cities, through the names and through the books that we're writing and reading. And much needs to be done still in education of what has been successful. Dr. Gnadiner argues for limited war, as does the ICRC. I argue for unlimited peace. One of the expansions of the actions of peace in times of war is precisely to deal with all aspects of conflict beyond violence, in the root causes as well as in the attitudes of the people who are affected. Henry Dunant's social enterprise. I was very happy to read and to hear today that it is a social enterprise, and a social enterprise is defined as an enterprise that applies a systematic effort to transform a social reality. In my current job as investment manager at LGT Venture Philanthropy, I must analyze social enterprises and see whether their impact is the highest, because given the limited resources we all have in the sector, we have to focus on those who have the highest potential. And in doing so, we analyze a few aspects of this enterprise. The first one would be the effectiveness of the solution. And there we have to ask, is the solution proposed effective to the challenge they are out there to combat? In reading through the International Committee of the Red Cross with this perspective in mind, I found that the International Committee of the Red Cross has, in the last year alone, helped 3.7 million internally displaced populations. It has worked or fed 2.8 million people in situations of vulnerability. 2.4 million people have been benefited by the sustainable production programs and microeconomic initiatives. 15 million by water sanitation, 500,000 in visits to detainees. Yet, I could not grasp entirely the answer to the question, are we succeeding? And this is a question I would like to invite Dr. Gnadiner to discuss at the end of our conversation. Efficiency. When we talked yesterday about conflict, and we explained basically the difference between conflict and violence, and that there was another way of transforming conflict before it went to that. I must say that if I were to analyze the model of the International Committee of the Red Cross, it focuses a lot in trying to make violence not so violent. In other words, to avoid the degradation of the conflict. This line prolonging itself down so far by putting limits to wars. The things that should not happen, the things that should not be done. And we said that this step from conflict to transformation before violence takes place utilizes a lot less resources, it has greater chances at succeeding, and it's by far the one that we in the International Committee of Peace Workers are trying to struggle to push forwards. The International Committee of the Red Cross has begun timidly, recently, to move in this direction, but still most of its actions are focused in transforming the violent representations of the conflicts. My last point in analyzing the social enterprise that I would like to bring to the table would be scalability. Can the impact be escalated? When I see an organization with 12,000 workers in the field, which is a very small organization for the mission it has, I still ask myself, can't we do more? And in analyzing the transformation of conflicts, if I were to continue with the analogy of business lingo, I would say this would be the value chain of conflict transformation. Conflict prevention and transformation would be the first of these tasks. And that means addressing all conflicts that are taking place, whether violent or not. The International Committee of the Red Cross has an amazing array of access to the different actors in conflict, armed, non-armed actors, as well as the civil society. Can more definite actions happen before violence takes place? Is a question that I would like to also address during our speech. The second one, ending violence, but ending all forms of violence. Yesterday we also spoke about structural and cultural violence. Can the International Committee of the Red Cross, with its mandate, address violence other than that violence that happens in war, as it has begun doing? My answer is yes. Please continue with the programs of prevention, implementation, and development. The third one, addressing the root causes. The International Committee of the Red Cross, in its assistance program, has begun implementing activities in the economic, security, water and habitat, health services, physical rehabilitation. They're all at the root of the conflicts that we're seeing. And again, much remains to be done, and no organization can do it all. But as long as it remains an objective, and we have clear targets to achieve, we can answer very much the question of, are we in track to achieve what we have set ourselves out to do? Are we being successful? Building peace resources. When you see the medical community today, we cannot cure all diseases yet, despite the fact that the medical sciences have developed for thousands of years to come to what we have today. More or less today, a doctor in Switzerland has to have the same skills that a general practitioner in Colombia, more or less. However, these doctors alone, as peace workers, because I do the analogy, violence is to peace what disease is to health. A doctor alone can go so far before he finds or she finds limitations. Therefore, you need instruments, which we have developed. Therefore, you need ambulances and helicopters to transport the wounded to hospitals that we need to build and equip. And then we need ministries of health to regulate the activities that happen in the sector. And we have created a supranational organization, the WHO, to continue researching and developing what health means. And today, health is much more than curing disease. It goes much beyond treating wounds. There's a holistic approach to health today. And there is the same need for peace building, where ending violence is just one of the steps in the large chain, and where much more reflection and decisive action for becoming holistic as well, multidisciplinary, determined, needs to be implemented. The last of these 5 necessary tasks that I have to share with you today is perhaps one of the most difficult ones. Not that any of them are easy. And it is healing. The International Committee of the Red Cross was created out of Dunant's compassion for the suffering. And it was the suffering from the direct effects of a battle. Things that should not happen. And then you heal sources, you heal wounds. But societies today, when violence has taken place, when no generation knows what peace means, need to heal as a community. And perhaps that goes beyond any single organization and resides in the domain of spirituality. But it's a necessary task, and it is part of what we do. And with this, I would like to end the intervention by saying the tasks are endless. The question is, are we up to the challenge? Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Segura, thank you very much for your pertinent comments. It was really excellent. Please have a seat. Dr. Gnedinger, would you like to react spontaneously to certain remarks and comments?
With great pleasure, because you were hitting right into the heart of a major frustration that I think any ICRC delegate has in its in his job, and I certainly do, and in the sense that we are very much aware that our work is extremely limited, and that we are actually only addressing the symptoms in terms of your broad agenda and not the root causes, and that we are only reacting to a very specific situation. So yes, I agree with your broad agenda. The question is simply, would ICRC be well advised now to enlarge its scope of action and become all that you aspire to us to become? And there, I think there have been many discussions in ICRC, important discussions, and from the start, ICRC has always made the same choice. And it started with the big fight, you know, between Henri Dunant and Moignet, who was then the president for a couple of decades, and who actually helped driving Henri Dunant out of the organization. The debate was, because Henri Dunant, he was a pacifist. Henri Dunant, he had your agenda. And actually, he won the first Nobel Prize for peace. And he won it together with a Frenchman who gave all his life for your work, peace work, infinite peace work. So that was his dream. But already Dunant, he was convinced at the time there will be more wars in Europe, as he saw it, simply as an observer of the reality. And I think he was unfortunately right. And but he still tried to convince the committee at the time to become more comprehensive and more large in its scope. And the founding fathers of the ICRC, these good Swiss, some mostly Genevan, but also Dufour and others, that, no, we concentrate on the task we have. Now we said we are going on the battlefield, we concentrate on the medical services, we do this, and we do it well, and we do it wherever it is needed. And that was the philosophy followed. The debate came up again after the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson came to Europe for a couple of months and then toured our countries. And he said, oh, well, this is very interesting, this Red Cross, you know. But now we don't need, there will be no more war. We have decided that now democracy has come to Europe, and that was the last time that we had war in this continent. And now we turn the Red Cross into, what do we do with that? It's a beautiful, huge organization, a social enterprise in the best sense of the term. Now we turn it into a peace-building instrument. That was his idea. So he, and our forefathers in the ICRC, they started to shake in Geneva and say, well, good, he's going to take it away from us. And they were not ready to follow that at all. So he took the Red Cross people to Paris and founded what was the League of Red Cross Societies at the time, parallel to the League of Nations. ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, stayed, again, very Swiss, concentrating on its limited scope of reacting to conflict situations. But within these conflict situations, indeed applying a holistic approach. I think where we, in our work, follow very much your idea is that we are needs-based. We go to the field, we want to see what are the problems of the people, what are the basic needs. And they're not only to come with a prefabricated services that we have aligned here, you know, that we bring food or that we bring shelter. But we go and see what are the specific needs of that given population out there in Colombia or in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then to build an operation out of that. But we did stick with that limitation to armed conflicts and indeed also other situations of violence. But if there is no violence involved in a situation, the ICRC as an organization will not become active. Now, but that is not at all to say that you're not right. I think you're very much right. So what we are saying simply is there is a tremendous need for complementarity between organizations and between approaches. Of course, there is, and I'm glad to hear from you and have confirmation that there every day, not only 12,000 or more people are working for peace. That is indeed complementary. And we are working very hard also within the international system to work out these mechanisms of complementarity. Also with the UN. The UN has a very broad mandate, obviously. They have a humanitarian mandate, they have a political mandate, they have security mandates, they have socio-economic mandates, and we think that we have a raison d'être as being separate but being complementary to these different UN approaches. So we need to, I think we need to remain distinct, remain limited, but be aware that we are complementary within a broader agenda of, indeed, of peacemaking, peace preservation.
Thank you, Angelo. There is no doubt that you are still highly motivated. And let me ask you whether you could react in very shortly in order that we can open a short discussion also.
Yes, I of course agree with you also from the point of view of a social investor that I am right now, that an organization has to focus on a core competency, otherwise we'll be doing too much. And as I said, in my opinion, the ICRC is a very small organization with only 12,000 workers for the mission it has. My invitation is, again, to go along the lines of what you have expressed and have this holistic view to that core competency. With a view of efficiency, if we are seeing a situation of violence, it is perhaps wise to complement the already existing action of transforming violence in armed conflict with those conflicts that could become violence in an armed way right before they do so. early warning systems, systems in place to react before the situation has degraded so far would allow a better use of resources and a higher chance of success, which I'm sure is already built in the structures of the ICRC.
Thank you. Now let me open the general discussion. Yes, please. Then you, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to continue this discussion here now at the end. I disagree with you, Fabio Segura. I agree with you, maybe because I'm from Geneva, but I think there is so much to do just in that limited area of making war more humanitarian or humane, if I may use that term, that you should really concentrate on that. And my question to you and also to our president of the session this morning is, in your mind, from a subjective perspective, if you have to look at what you did, I think you mixed the two, the personal and the institutional level very well, how important you think are something which you did not address specifically, sort of the secret counsel that you give to governments and to warring parties in terms of you're going too far, you should not go too far. And I think this is an excellent and important contribution of the Red Cross, of the committee, that no other party really does well, because other parties are not neutral as you are. Other parties are motivated by national interest. So what they say behind the scenes is usually also interest-based, whereas you really have a normative basis for your action there. So I'd like to also hear Jakob Nuesch on this, because he was very active in the committee.
Well, indeed, I think that is a very, very important dimension of our work, which by nature is not very much publicized. But I think this is maybe where we, quite indirectly, but I believe in an important way, do contribute to the larger agenda, to the larger political and peace agenda. I mean, if I just take, let's say, the last 7, 8 years, or 8 years it is now, since 9/11, I mean, we did have a very complex and not at all easy dialogue with the United States of America during the 8 years. It's become a bit easier, not only since the beginning of this year. Of course, since the beginning of this year, it is much easier, although still legally and complex. But it started already to ease up towards the end of the second Bush administration. What goes on there is that, and that also applies to the Taliban. I mean, we are, okay, the forms are different, the forms of dialogue are different, but the intention, the perspective, the agenda is the same. It is to go to the field, to take note of what we hear and see, and to report this to those who carry responsibility for the hostilities, the military and the political level. And in the case of the United States, if we just take this example, it meant to document what we saw and heard in places of detention, but also what we hear if there is an attack on a village and our people are there, we go and document this and bring this to the commander. And what we can say is that during all this period of time, there was a real dialogue, versus substantive dialogue at all levels, and it did enlarge throughout the whole. And you can imagine what the military commanding lines are, and the complexity of this. So the dialogue did enlarge. We were listened to, and the real compliment, the real feedback that was important to me was when I heard of one of my colleagues who went to Washington and came back, and he heard from one of the legal advisors down there saying, well, you know, you have taken a lot of importance, maybe something a bit too much importance in this city, because you are the only independent validators of our policies. And I mean, this is really where we can have an impact. And yes.
The lady near the pillar.
Is this working? Okay. Go ahead. Okay. My question is about China. My question is, if you are aware of what's happening in China to prisoners of conscience, what is happening in labor camps, and that a very special group, they are kept for taking off their organs and being transplanted and ending with death. And this is concerning tens of thousands of people. I have just in my mind that you said, what are the troubles of people? Are you operating in China? Are you aware of this question? It is prisoners of conscience because they all follow one Buddhist school. And they are very, very tough people, and they are always peaceful, and they are not defending themselves. So I think there is a special need to make aware the public of this situation. China tries to cover always the trouble it has with other people, and it was very, very much practiced by Chinese people, and when the groups grew bigger than Chinese Communist Party memberships, it was banned. People are tortured. Do you know this? Can you help?
React on?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, we do follow all the reports we do get, and we analyze all the evidence from all over the world, not only in China, but in other countries as well. And we are very much aware that, yes, there are many abuses, many situations where we have no access, where we have no impact, that are still existing. Now, again, I'm coming back to that issue of complementarity. We are definitely, and we stick to that, although it is sometimes frustrating, we stick to that we are not an advocacy group. Now, with regard to that, or with regard to other issues, we would, yes, gather the information and go and discuss and take this as an encouragement to go and discuss privately with whoever is concerned, whatever the authority is concerned, in order to indeed get access to the situation and become a useful instrument for them to stop whatever practices there are. Now, we do realize that this is only one way of responding to that, and that very much other ways, and particularly advocacy, can have an impact, and does have an impact. So we see our effort very much as being complementary to what, for instance, is being done by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, other organizations that are very serious in documenting patterns of abuse and who are doing exactly what you are saying. Now, again, we deliberately have chosen one way of addressing the issue. So and I said it, our operational imperative is to get access to the problem where it is. And we will, all our policies, including the communication policies, will be supportive of this objective. So we will not communicate in a way that will stop us or will hinder us from achieving that specific objective.
Maybe a last question before coffee break, where a discussion can go on.
Is it my turn now? Thank you. I would like to pose a question to Mr. Segura.
concerning a link to yesterday's talk of Mr. Zirpka, who explained that in preventing violence, starting with very young children, he claimed that it was 4 times more cost-effective than intervening. He said that from longitudinal studies from the United States, you could show that every dollar spent in crime prevention would save the community $4 in the intervention, spending on prisons, etc. So the question concerns global politics. If you transfer that to the effort of peacekeeping, could it be that every dollar spent in the direction that you favor, Mr. Segura, would save $4 in intervention and cure of wars? Could it be that there is a problem with who says what is effective? Do we talk about gains in human well-being, or do we talk about gains in the pockets of big multinational corporations? And could it be that prevention is effective in terms of enhancing human well-being, but it might be counterproductive in economic terms?
There is a very interesting question, I believe. To begin with, early child education prevents things that, because they're prevented, are unseen. Those who did not go to prison, or those who did not end up in jail as criminals, are good kids, and therefore it's harder to sell. It's harder to obtain resources for them. If you see educational budgets worldwide, early childhood education is almost regretted, although it is a time in the development of the brain that the greatest changes occur in our lifetime. It's something similar when it comes to conflicts. When you don't see the wounded, when you don't see the atrocities that the news can show once there has been violence exploding, it's harder to obtain funding, and it's harder to obtain actions. And these decisive political decisions do not come as fast. And us as a community are not pointing our leaders in that direction. It's only when something terrible happens, like September 11, that we all then try to do something about it once we have evidence of a brutal event happening. But as I said yesterday, there's other September 11s that are by far the big part of the iceberg under the water. The 30,000 children dying of preventable diseases per day, 1 child every 3 seconds. We're not holding a minute of silence for them. We're not holding immediate United Nations councils to address that fact. And I would say yes, and this is also the topic of my intervention, transforming any conflict is very challenging. It's even more challenging once it has degraded into violence. If you are to protect the victims of armed conflict, I think, and I defend the theory, that it would be much more efficient and fast to do it before they have become victims of armed conflict. But I do very much second the fact that we are different organizations acting, and we need coordination, and we need to better work in each of our core competencies so that we really become a movement that we're still not.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we leave,